So I think New London needs a lot of work. I think it's history. I think it's those people. You know, we're working with a redistributive justice tradition. The fundamental debates that we were debating then, we were trying to reconcile whole language and DI. We split right in the room in New London. Gunther and Norman and Mary and Jim wanted genre and wanted functional linguistics. A lot of us, Courtney and I, wanted a pedagogical model. Bill and Jim and I wanted a political model. And it was a utopian model. It was a belief that following the post-Fordist, postmodern moment, that we could break up the hegemony of print literacy that had been used to marginalize and dominate and had been part of that project, that we could break up the degree to which print literacy had been a club to beat people over the head. As Phyllis Steeves, the Cree scholar at Calgary, says, oh, you want Aboriginal literacies now? It's just part of that extension of the project of appropriation from the Enlightenment that Western science is undertaking. So we were playing that game on the one hand, but at the same time we had a dream before Facebook, before Snowden, before the radical loss of social capital that's occurred since then. We had a dream in the 1990s that we could use the digital as an emancipatory to change the subject, to radically shake up the distribution of knowledge and power. And now it's 2 decades later, and that part of the utopian project has failed. We aren't seeing any greater degree of redistributive social justice, and the questions that Claire began with are still on the table, which is, okay, so we can get voice. If I read one more paper that celebrates the voice that we can get through voice, well, we all know from Derrida what's wrong with the metaphor of voice. It's phonocentric, yada, yada, yada. Nonetheless, if I read one more principally American paper about the celebration of voice without an understanding of what that might mean in terms of political economy, planetary survival, and ethics. Ethics, ethics, ethics. How can we do ethics without Habermas? That's what I asked Doug Hillman. Can we actually come up with an ethics in a way to learn to live together? Because that's what the kids are reading about in the adolescent dystopian fiction. So let's stop and let's open it up now and we've hit some buttons and there's plenty to talk about and plenty of notes and plenty of exposition that could be done by you or me or Claire. So let's just start.
Well, I got a certain tension. What happened in your session in band? Where did it go after that day? Was there any, I know you're not going to get any reconciliation, but what came together after, yeah.
Gosh. Well, we all went away and wrote separate papers.
In clusters.
In clusters. And I would say, and Allan will obviously chip in, that the through line is that we're looking at a curriculum that's about relationality, that's about engagement, that's place-based. It's not indigenous ways of learning just taken and plonked into the curriculum, but it shares, I think, a lot of the values of intergenerational, as Allan said,
intergenerational
looking
gifting.
forward, looking back.
And story, we listened on day 3, after we had started coming back together, we listened to Thomas King's Massey lectures as a stimulus. So Snowden, try to put in the same room, Snowden, Google, 24/7 surveillance, and Thomas King's story. That's what we were trying to do, okay? Because we wanted to recover an ethics of care and an ethics of healing that might give us a way forward. So there are about 5 through lines that I'll go to when we get to the summary that are all unresolved, where we don't have punchlines. And then at the end of BAMF, we said, we aren't going to form a club. We aren't going to self-canonize. We're going to take this to UBC next week and open it up and say, let's all start the work. All of us. You know, damned who owns it or damned who said it first, because this is too important for that. Okay? So I'll give you the through lines around citizenship, around Google and political economy, around a performative model of embodied, bringing the body back, bringing place back in the face of virtuality and digital, And understanding that diversity is not political correctness, but it's requisite for species survival. Diversity of text, diversity of message, diversity of knowledge, all the way around the line. So we ran, I think we got some through lines, but they were tough. They were tough to get. And they're all unresolved. And we've got about 10,000 words that we're going to glue together now. Yes?
Fascinating. I come at it from, this is probably irrelevant, but I'll tell you anyway.
No.
I've been in the field for 35 years. I ran large theater fan audiences, the largest in North America, only Aboriginal arts program in the country, yada, I can go on. When we began, so there's a professional company and a learning institution aside from it. The work that we were doing across the country is about dissonance, and the kids respected it. In nearly whatever the subject matter about professional play was, or the work they were doing, it was about empty spaces that they filled. When I left 3 years ago, the work is about the pressure of the institution of education for compliance. And for compliance with, if I hear the word oversight, I used to hate the word stakeholder, I hate the word oversight. So there's pressure that way. From the field itself, the Canada Council and adult art, comes the pressure they have from their own corporate world of selling and, I'm not a Marxist, maybe I am, I'm not sure anymore, but.
It's okay.
But the business model, art fitting into the business model. So that's what the kids see. They know, they sniff it out, they know when learning is doing an experience and it represents what they're doing. I don't know how it fits in. I used to be a pedagogist. I understood it from this very university. I feel there's a huge split between those of us in the field who are working and using, and the wonderful and exciting and interesting ideas you have between those of us who are running theaters and arts institutions and cultural here in Vancouver, and that's all I wanted to add. And I wish there was a way of bringing it closer together, because there's power in that, and there needs to be, absolutely needs to be. The work is becoming too legitimized into the boredom, and there's no Canadian voice in it. I'm an optimist.
Bonnie?
Thank you. What I wonder, these are obviously fascinating questions that really have been recycled in many ways, different ways. My question is, what responsibility do we have to work with policymakers, principals, parents, so that when we talk, for example, when you talked about multiliteracies and teachers then translated that as this kid needs to do more work. What is our responsibility to work with those teachers who need to provide, report backs to parents, who need to work with, examination systems? Is it fair for us to remain, in a sense, in a conversation and not necessarily take up these very real issues that teachers have to deal with? So I guess my question is, what is our responsibility to those people?
For Banff, in this group, one of the things I like about Workland in Calgary is it's a frontline, large-scale teacher education institution. Everybody there is doing their grunt hours of 8 to 10 hours of pre-service teacher ed. Everywhere that I've worked, we've been in frontline teacher education, and everywhere that I've worked, we've been in school reform. So ultimately, that to me, there's no question that we try to work these things out in ways that we think have programmatic political efficacy, but we can't just work them out to get published in Harvard Ed Review. We've actually got to bring them to ground, and all of my work has been about that. Everything that I've tried to do intellectually has tried to come back to those constituencies that we got into, that I used to teach in the Fraser Valley. That to me is, so what we haven't solved, to come back to your question, is, first of all, we think, in my view, the model that is presently being pursued of schooling, that we're all feeling oppressed by, etc., and is being globalized, it will collapse. It will inevitably collapse. It'll hit the limits of its own performativity, and it will be held accountable by legislators, by the public, etc., as having failed. Okay, I have no doubt. We're old enough to have seen these things happen. What we did with New London is we read Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe's Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. And in that book, one of Laclau and Mouffe, looking at Thatcherism and looking at the left falling apart in the face of Thatcherism, what Laclau and Mouffe argue for is they argue for a public politics that generates coalitions and social movements around what they call particular nodal points in discourse. So every project, educational project that I've worked in, we've sat down in groups and brainstormed what will be the nodal point in discourse that will thematically capture this, that people will be able to rally around. Teachers will be, and educators will be able to rally around. So multiliteracies was a very deliberate choice. That was what Jim G., when we started that project, and I've told the story many times, Courtney turned to Jim and me and said, "This will never work." And we said, "Why?" And she said, "Because A, there's too many big egos in the room." And she said, "And B, you and Jim are just those critical pedagogy people." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "All you want to do is do critique, and you've got tenure doing critique. You don't actually want to get down there and change it." And that's Courtney as a Quaker communist from the 50s, basically putting you through her acid test, which is, are you committed to actually taking this airy-fairy stuff you talk about and make it work? So we have to create a nodal point. We haven't done that with Banff because we don't know what it is yet. But if you think of the work, productive pedagogies, in Singapore and around that time and in Queensland, Bill Green, we sat around a room and just brainstormed until we had something that the left and the right could handle. Critical literacy as a new basic, the new basics, that was Queensland curriculum reform. So each time that we've created a reform, and multiliteracies is actually a discourse creation, it was deliberately engineered to both engage self and other, to engage the right wing and the left, to engage, because we pushed critical literacy to conservative fundamentalist parents by simply saying, "You seen that porn on the internet? You want your kids to go there? We better make them critical." Okay? So we always want to be to run an open church, to be heteroglossic and somewhat ambivalent. Now, the problem that we have with that, which I said about moral responsibility, is once you create an educational groundswell or a movement working with government, and in many cases we've worked with government with these things, then do you run away and make money like Tony Blair, or do you actually carry some weight of moral responsibility? Bearing in mind that unlike reading recovery, you can't copyright it and patrol it. The worst thing you could do, and I think that some schools of educational thought do this, is they take multiple intelligences, reading recovery, it gets commodified, and then they police it, or they attempt to police it. You're in the club, you're not in the club. You're doing systemic functional linguistics properly, you aren't doing it properly, okay? When in fact, what did Foucault teach us? Foucault taught us that discourse, in the archaeology of knowledge, he says, discourse, the uptake of discourse is always idiosyncratic and eccentric. Okay, so anything that we put out there in the public policy or in educational discourse, you want it to be heteroglossic, bearing in mind that it will have very, very eccentric and diverse local uptakes, implementations, commodifications, etc. You bear some moral responsibility, but you can't ultimately control discourse. So it's always a, do you see what I mean? It's a very, very, reform is a very complex game. Jen.
Are you concerned about, so you said, okay, we've taken new literacies, it's been somewhat, I don't know, bastardized, if you will, or...
1,000 flowers bloom.
Okay, so, and then you're saying, okay, we want to rethink this to be more, perhaps inclusive even of indigenous ways of, I'm going to say indigenous ways, but indigenous knowledge or relational pedagogies, to think about it differently. Are you not concerned about that same process happening along the way once we take up other knowledge systems in that way?
Absolutely, absolutely. Everybody in the room was concerned about that. Everybody in the room was concerned, and certainly the indigenous people in the room were very concerned that their attempt to ally with this kind of a thing was going to lead to the appropriation and the appropriation and the colonization, recolonization of their knowledge. The queer theory people in the room were worried. The Frankfurt School people were worried. I mean, it was, you put an intellectual project on the table, and the metaphor that I had is everybody was holding it up to the light over the week and saying, how can this be used how can this be abused? And so, yes, I'm worried about that. And as soon as we thought that we were on the same page, then we started running other scenarios, right, the last few days.
Yeah.
What harm can be done with this? Okay? Does that answer the question, Jen?
Well, I think it's important to raise the question, and,
Yeah.
but I guess it's where, where do you go with the conversation? So.
Yep. By the same token, and if you overthink that, you can become paralyzed very quickly. Okay? So all of the process, you're absolutely is right. So, and certainly from a lot of different theoretical perspectives, people were going, whoa, hold on, selling out my constituency by joining this boat, by pitching into this one. Or classical questions of theoretical commensurability. You're going to try to put Adorno next to performative, Adorno next to performative models of theater and art. How is this going to work? So people were, it was troubling.
And I think one of the challenges is that we can't keep using the same language, right? We can't use the old language because then that gives a signal. People say, oh, it's that. It's just that packaged in a different form. I think the worst moment of the week for me, if I'm frank, is when I was shut in a room with Rebecca Luce-Kapler from Queens, the poet, also an educator, and we had the charge of writing about what these pedagogies would look like on the ground. There were 3 curriculum theorists there. Dennis Samara had a migraine. Rebecca and I just sat and looked at each other and said, okay, we can't use the old language. We've got to reinvent this in 2 hours. It's an impossible task.
For Courtney Kasdan, you know what I mean? Like, who could have done it in her sleep? But it was a very we jostled everybody, we gave everybody tasks out of their comfort zone because we didn't want the same answers. And we got something different. One of the things that Claire and Dennis and Courtney came up with, because we were looking for that nodal point, was to talk about, to use the notion of performative pedagogy, to use the notion of performative. Precisely because of what you said, which is at the heart of the neoliberal hyper-capitalist agenda is performance reviews, performance assessment. And we thought, let's take it back. Let's take that term, reappropriate that term performativity back to mean embodied, real physicality again, and also in Austin's Speech Act term of a performative utterance, of a doing. Okay, so we were actually working around the pedagogy models to try to come up with that. So yes, this is, everything you say is right in that regard. The dangers are there. And when you venture on something like this. The other thing is, having lived through 4 or 5 of these projects over the last few decades, you get really paranoid about what's going to happen in Abbotsford when they get a hold of it. To come back to Bonnie's, what a bunch of French immersion teachers get a hold of the 4 resources model. What's going to happen? Okay, so you're both trying to anticipate idiosyncratic uptakes, while at the same time provide a generative platform. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Allan. I'm only an MA student here, and before that, I was majored in journalism and communication studies. So I'm really interested in pop culture and education. I was fascinated by the phenomenon that you mentioned, that teachers keep incorporate pop culture into the class, and they keep failing. They incorporate topics from pop culture, and now teachers realize the digital forms, the digital media. So the forms of pop culture, so they also incorporate, and they keep failing. And in Bonnie's work, 2003 and 2008, she found that Archie comic books that interests students, and students found any texts in school are boring, but pop culture is interesting. And also in media studies, there's a study with empirical evidence to prove that students feel that any information endorsed by teachers are considered boring, while endorsed by peers are considered more valued. And from your talk, I see one of the explanations for such phenomenon. You talk about the geography of school. And in Bonnie's work, she talks about, because in pop culture, there are varieties of possibilities of identity construction compared to in school texts. School texts are more sanitized, so it has very limited opportunities for identity construction. So maybe students are more interested in bigger varieties, offerings of opportunities for identity construction. So I'm thinking about the answers to solve this problem. What do you think?
No solution. I mean, those are really, Teresa's work is considered it, Bonnie's work is considered it. There's this thing that happens when it gets reframed. The same text, when it's replacing a text in a different location, physical location, embodied location, it's not the same text, is it? Where they don't experience it as the same text. So I think, do you have any comment on this, Terry?
Well, I'm still back when you said the despair, the illic despair, illic type despair.
With the school, yeah.
And the notion that the impossibility, if you will, of reform, but yet we have to make this commitment, and then Courtney's asked a test, and I don't know what to do about school. I don't know what to do about school. That's what I want to know. Where do you end up with what to do?
Here's how we ended up. We listened to Thomas King, and in the Massey lectures and the Truth About Stories, and every one of you should listen to it if you haven't, especially those of you who are not from here, because it'll help you get a sense of this. And what King says is he tells the same story about the turtles on each other's back, and then he says, go and write your own ending. But don't say you didn't hear this story. So ultimately, in New London, what we tried to do was we tried to come up with a programmatic agenda for schooling reform, right? And I think my favorite baby in New London was the pedagogy. Not the semiotics models, which I think led to formalism, but the actual, Courtney and I have stuck with that. We still believe in models of weaving. That pedagogy actually, that there's a place for direct instruction. There's a place for behaviorist pedagogy. It's just that it's one bit of a cycle that good teachers do, depending upon the kids and the target. But I think the question for schooling, what we came up with Thomas King, is given these times, because Julian Sefton Green said, you know, you want to rent it or love it or leave it? You want to de-school? In London, we have no choice. They have to physically be in the physical plant for 6 hours. So you can de-school all you want. They're going to put us in jail if we try that. In other settings, some people were saying in the room, but what about STEM? Why don't we, schooling is a good technology for developing traditional Eurocentric Western knowledge. Let's keep it in place for doing that. So what Courtney and Jim went away to do is they said, why don't we write 5 endings for this pedagogy? And say, here are some principles. You must proceed ethically. You must engage kids with knowledge that will be about planetary survival. We have to look at text for healing and other kinds of functions than we've traditionally, etc. You proceed. But here's one story. No de-school. Here's another story. And they gave an example in the Northern Territory Aboriginal School where they basically are cutting school down to 50% of its time, leaving it to do what Western culture does, and then letting the community do the rest. Here's a total out-of-schooling model, a community education model, if you will. Here's a within-school model. So we thought that one approach to this, instead of being that educational reform always fails with the one-size-fits-all model, when in fact it's very limited, and that we'd come up with 5 or 6 alternative endings that would be on a continuum of schooling or de-schooling.
How are you going to avoid getting the strange bedfellow people on the right who are going to co-opt that as choice or something crazy, you know, or non-public, like deep dismantling public education?
You run an ethics line through it. You run an ethics and a citizenship line through it. Because the reason that we didn't want to, around the room, the reason Claire and Yvonne Pratt also talked about residential schools and then talked about growing up growing up Métis, and how the school was an ambiguous force. That it wasn't just a colonizing force, it was also gave her,
Exactly.
similar to your narrative, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we run a line that says, all of us around the room thought the public school is actually a worthy project. That especially with radical individualism and with total separation of people and with actual incidents with this degree of bowling alone, hyper-bowling alone, the lack of social capital, that in fact if we gave up on the project of a public cultural touchstone and a common public space, we were going to be in big trouble. So there was that, would you agree? That was
Yeah,
right around the-
totally.
totally
And
around
whenever
the-
we seem to be straying off that narrative, Courtney would,
Yeah. Courtney put her hand down and say,
Yeah.
unless we learn to live together, we're just going to all separate off into these privatized worlds in spite of the digital community. And basically we're going, all of the factionalization and tribalism is going to just accelerate. So the argument across the room was, this will be about schooling.
yeah.
Rob, and then we're coming around the room. Go ahead.
So Allan, I just visited Walgett, which is a
Yeah.
remote Aboriginal town primarily in Australia. And there the issue of schooling for Aborigines is a focus point among various peoples. And so it's almost not an issue of, as I think you were saying a little just a second ago, it's almost not an issue of schooling, it's an issue of community. And as you know, in Australia, that space is a very tricky space for somebody like me to enter into, let alone the cross currents.
Yes.
You know, if I was sailing in these sort of conditions, I would pull down the sails and give up, type of thing. So, how did you guys get into those really complex issues of mixed vested interests, even among Indigenous communities, and those layers of currents that exist that surround schools and schooling, but they I think indeed they override the schooling forces at times.
Well,
Well, that's a hard one. I mean, I just talking to Yvonne about a related question, and you know, Indigenous communities don't serve everybody perfectly. That's why you can't take that model and just go, oh,
There isn't
right?
an Indigenous model.
No.
that's right. Well, see, the other problem that we had is we wanted to, and I think when it's unrigorously applied, the Louis Malle funds of knowledge, the danger that you have that comes out of American multiculturalism and American critical race studies is you wind up romanticizing the community
Exactly,
as
yeah.
the antithesis for a divided, and it's another white fiction. Okay, we've got the school as dividing, oppressive, colonizing force, and we have the pristine community, whether it's the Hispanic community or the Indigenous community, et cetera, where dogs, what would Bob Dylan say, where dogs run free and people, you know, I mean, yada yada. So I think that's the other thing about it, okay, is that you can't risk, in the face of all of the conflict and the difficulties within communities, urban communities, and Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities as well. And I can speak about the Chinese community, Chinese American community, very complex and very vast. You can't risk romanticizing them as the antithesis to white oppression or to white dominant hegemonic oppression or something like that. And I think a lot of critical work, left work, does that. Okay, and it's very difficult because the ethics of social science, and Yvonne and I were speaking about this, and we certainly dealt with this issue. You talked about the impassibility for yourself of the issues of violence, the issues of family transitions, of family, of the status of the family in communities everywhere right now is a really, really vexed one, where you can barely, who has the right to speak about what? Are these things that are decided and adjudicated internally? Gay families as well, alternative family structures. It's clear that the family is the other bit of this. that is the unspoken, the unsaid. I've often told graduate students, one of the things, you said, well, why do you always go where you don't go? I always look for the unsaid. And I always look for what's outside of doxa. And right now, we can't say anything about the family. Even though the family, remember, the breakup of the extended family and the transition to the nuclear family in North America occurred between 1860 and roughly 1910. And what we saw was the flowering of millenarial religion, fundamentalism, of all kinds, from Mormonism to Adventism to why, in response to the breakup of family and the shift from rural to industrial economy. And G. Stanley Hall's great work, Adolescence, comes about around the end of the 19th century with the emergence of youth gangs, etc. So the last time we had, I'm still a Marxist, the last time that we had a major shift in the material means of production with all of the agglomerated cultural change, etc., the family went to hell. I mean, in the preface I wrote for you guys the other day, I pointed out that childhood occurred with the economic shift of a bourgeois and leisure family that ruling classes in Europe in the 15th and 16th century, when you didn't need kids to work anymore. And you could afford to bring in people and space for a separate sphere. There was no childhood before that. Lawrence Stone, okay, in the history of childhood. So what we're on with, between the digitalization of family, the reconfiguration of family, post-feminism, post-queer theory, now with the new social contract around marriages, we're going to see family radically reconfigured in ways. And what are we doing? Well, it's a hot button. We don't want to go there. The nuclear family is actually being reconstructed and dissolved in ways that are going to have major, major consequences. But it's too politically hot for any of us to talk about. Whoa.
I don't think it's too hot. I think that's exactly what we should be talking about.
Who has the right to speak about whose families?
Well, I think we just reframe the whole notion of what is family.
Jen.
I mean, picking up on Rob's point and your point, I go back to the story of Tom King's, that narrative frame, the narrative frame that he repeats at the end in The Truth About Stories. That narrative frame is also speaking to a kind of responsibility that we have with stories, so stories that are told to us. And you know, I'm also drawn to, going back again to the indigenous perspectives in which that you're drawing on, that indigenous knowledge takes up protocols that are just as important as the knowledge itself. So, you know, maybe when your ship comes, Rob, maybe you don't. Sorry, when the boat comes along and the sails go, you just kind of keep sailing, because there's just certain knowledge that's not even ours to. It's not ours to address. It's not ours to take up. It's not even ours to know. It's for, you know, those communities to decide what we share, what we bring in, what we'll sort of let out to others. I don't know if
that does make sense, because
protocols around knowledge are really difficult for people to understand, that there's just some knowledge that's just not ours, and it's up to the communities to decide if they want to share it or if they don't want to share it.
What's been taken out of what we had in Banff was it was a series of ritual dances where everybody who was there had to put the group to its ritual test. Okay? And I think what King speaks about is the ritual processes of intergenerational exchange are through story they're the very thing that are being stripped out. They're the very thing that we need to reinstall. The reconciliation, I think, of being a white male and going into indigenous community, or being a Chinese male and going into indigenous communities, which I spoke about last time I was here with you, is the only way that I was reconciling. And I've just gone back and reread some of Celia Haig Brown's work about white allies and what her father taught her and what her place is in all of this. So is when you construe it, Rob, as a form of intergenerational gifting, it takes the whole weight off of your shoulders. Because it means you go to Walgett, as a white male, you present a gift of knowledge. People can refuse it, people can accept it, but if you go to as the white male with authoritative knowledge, then you're in trouble. So it partly depends upon your entry across cultures, or your movement across cultures, partly depends upon ritual, I think.
And relationship.
Ritual, relationship, and story, not upon rationality. Because the very domination which I'm doing now, but we experienced there, is that I'm an academic, I have a PhD, I'm male, I'm an authoritative knower, so I will speak. You can critique, but I can speak, okay? But that doesn't speak to the ritual and the gift and the story. So I think, Rob, that answers the question about how not just you and Walgett, but how any of us move across borders, is we go bearing gifts. And we go bearing narrative gifts about ourselves, our kin, our place, and our knowledge. And the locals are completely within their rights to say, no thanks, as part of a ritual. Okay, so I think that may be the way to stitch it. And it takes us back to the performative. A poem or a story or something is a very different gift than the kind of textbook. Yeah.
I'm not sure how to pose this, but I'm interested in looking at the artefact of Rich Tass, and unfortunately it is an artefact in the context of what's going on in Australia at the moment.
Yes.
But I think it's an enactor, and I think on the ground, educators, whether they be experienced or pre-service, need those enactors to work within the curriculum.
Agreed. That came up. Rich Tass did come up. Rich Tass did come up as you know, we did work in Queensland implementing them. The IB later take them on, and the Finns just discovered them. Okay? So I just got a call. I got contacted by the Finnish ministry, and they said they'll talk to us about Rich Tass. Okay? And all we did was poach it from Ted Sizer and Dewey and Frere and Vygotsky. So it's not hard. And the authentic assessment people. Okay? The notion of giving kids holistic, what Dewey called them, enterprises in the child and the curriculum. 1912, okay, at the University of Chicago, giving the kids a whole enterprise, like you do in career fields, giving them a performance to put together, which call upon the reassemblage of embodied competence, the opposite of the fragmentation. Whole language was on about that as well, right? About unified organic tasks. So I think, as a to come back to Bonnie's question, certainly Alberta, especially now that they've got nothing in place, has gone down the road, is moving towards Rich Tass. The Finnish are going to what they call, they're using phenomenology to talk about giving kids whole orienting activities that are real world, problem-based, and substantive, around which they will build curriculum. And we use them in Queensland in a Rich Tass model. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that we might, even though we might have to rebrand it to make it cute, you know, anything that we come up with as a programmatic way forward here is probably going to just be something that, it might be something that simple. Is that what you think?
I think it's also a way of going back to the intent of Garth Boomer and others.
Yeah, Garth nailed it. Yeah. Over here first, Tony. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm kind of interested in the idea